Hello and welcome. This is your instructor, Dennis Westman, and today I want to talk a little bit more about Tutorial 5 and the last two sections. So as we've done in the previous videos, go ahead and grab your book, and we're going to again look at Tutorial 5, and we're going to begin on page 250, which is section 5.2, and this section deals with filtering and manipulating data. And so if you look on page 252, talks about filtering data, and really what this section deals with is taking a look at being able to add the filter options, which includes the arrows in the header row that allows you to filter and pull out or only see certain sets or subsets of data. And so you can filter for one column, you can filter on multiple columns, and you can even do some advanced filtering that takes into account if statements, ands, ors, functions, those kinds of things. But typically the easiest and what most people are going to do is just filtering using the filter arrows at the header row of the various columns. And so on page 252 it talks about filtering using one column, and whenever you click on one of those little drop down arrows, you'll be able to see the different ways that you can filter out different sections of data. Again, very handy tool within Microsoft Excel. On page 254, it talks a little bit about exploring the different types of text filters. Maybe you want to do a text filter where it starts with a certain series of letters, or maybe you'll want to do something differently. Well, you can do those with text filters. And as I mentioned earlier, at the bottom of page 254, you can use multiple columns and multiple filtering items as well. You can also clear filters. Let's say, for instance, you're finished, you don't want to filter the data, you want to reset it back to its original state, and what you can do is actually clear all of the filters so that they now are gone and all your data is now visible again to the end user. And clearing the filters is talked about on page 255. Also, at the bottom of page 255 is selecting multiple filter items. And this is, say, for instance, you want to copy and paste a particular section, then with the filter applied, you can pull that data out and maybe copy it and paste it into a new worksheet. Look on page 256, and you can see some additional information about creating a more complex filter. And at the bottom of that, you can see the different options for how you can actually filter text, numbers, and dates. And again, the filtering is a very powerful tool. You definitely want to take some time and explore it. And I think most of you outside of this class are going to want to filter using the filter by column or filter by multiple columns using the little drop down arrows, because that is by far the easiest and the fastest way to get at certain sets of data. Page 257, 258 talk a little bit more about the different types of filters. 259 talks about creating a total row in your certain table, and you can actually go in and add a new row at the bottom of your table of data and perform some sort of calculation that either counts or adds or averages those items, and that's talked about on page 259. It's explained in further detail on page 260, and then 261 talks about splitting the worksheet windows into various panes. Let's say you have a very complex worksheet and you need to be able to see different sections of the worksheet. Well, you can lock or freeze or split the Excel window into multiple panes, allowing you to see different sections of the Excel spreadsheet. And so, of course, your assignment requires you to do this. But when you're working on your own in other spreadsheets, you may want to look at something at the very top and then maybe something at the very bottom. Well, using the panes option allows you to go in and split that data. And 262 talks more about that. And then on page 263, it talks about creating subtotals. And if you look in your book, again on page 263, looking at the subtotals, first couple of lines, you can summarize data in a certain range by inserting subtotals, and it offers many kinds of summary information including counts, sums, averages, minimums, maximums. And there's actually a subtotal command that will allow you to go in and be able to add that subtotal option for that particular range of data. Now this is one of those that you may have some problems with. I think I've already answered several questions from folks that's had issues with this in an assignment, and I would definitely pay attention to page 263 at the bottom, where it talks about calculating subtotals for a range of data, and be sure to follow those directions closely, because that will definitely help you whenever you are working on assignments and then come test time. 264, 265 talks additionally about the subtotal areas. And then on page 266, it adds an additional element to the subtotal feature, and this is by including the outline view. And if you look at the diagram on page 266, which is 5-26, what you can actually do is, with the outline view, you can group data elements together so that whenever you click on the pluses and the minus symbols over on the far left-hand side by the row headers, you can actually expand or collapse the level of detail that you're seeing. It's a very, very handy feature. So let's say you have a really, really large, complex Excel worksheet and you only want to see the totals. Well, you can go through and adjust the expanding and collapsing the features in the outline view and only see certain sections of the spreadsheet. Maybe you only want to see the total rows for everything, or maybe you only want to see the total rows for a certain category of items. Using the outline view options and expanding and collapsing the views allows you to go in and actually do that. It's very, very helpful. I would encourage you to explore it. I know in just my work here at Murray State, I use it constantly because I'm looking at a lot of accounts in my position here at the college. And what happens is, a lot of times I just need to see the bottom line, or maybe I need to see the summary of the accounts based on certain categories. And so I use the outline view to actually go in and expand or collapse the level of detail to only see what I need to see. So it's very, very handy. Again, it's on page 266, 267. I would encourage you to take time to read that and review it, because of course you'll see it again on exams, but it is a helpful tool to use beyond this class. Okay, moving on now, let's talk a little bit about section 5.3 in tutorial 5, which is dealing with the pivot tables and pivot charts. And this section begins on page 268, and that's just a visual overview of the different options within a pivot table and pivot charts. Let's look on page 270 and actually talk a little bit about the definition of a pivot table. A pivot table really allows you to take a lot of Excel data and condense it into certain columns and rows using certain fields, grouping that information together and summarizing somehow with a function like count, sum, average, and those kinds of things. It's very, very handy, again, especially if you have a huge amount of data and you need to be able to summarize it quickly. And so really what happens is with a pivot table, it allows you the flexibility to take all of that, arrange it a certain way. If you need to see it in a different way, take some fields out, take some functions out, add some others back, rearrange it again, refresh it, and you have your data presented in a nice, easy to read, understand, compact, precise data table. And if you look on page 270, it gives you some examples of a pivot table with just the basic pivot table and with the rows and columns pivoted. And really all that is just taking that information and summarize it or condensing it in a certain way that makes it easier to read. And I like on page 271 in your textbook to actually give a pivot table sketch, which is just sort of their way of planning out how exactly they want their pivot tables to look. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because the book is very, very detailed, step-by-step directions as far as creating a pivot table. There are key points throughout the section that gives you step-by-step directions. One I would like to point out first is on page 272, which is the actual steps for creating a pivot table. This is in the little kind of reddish brownish box that's called reference. These are the step-by-step directions on creating a pivot table. And then if you look on page 274, these are the different layout areas that are areas that you can manipulate or change to create your pivot table. The row labels, the column labels, the filter, and then the values that you want to summarize. 275 talks about adding different fields to the pivot table. You can apply styles to the pivot table, which means just a collection of colors, font size, font types, those kinds of things. That's on page 276. If you need to format the values, maybe change them from number to currency, that is explained on the bottom of page 276. You can also rearrange the pivot table like I was mentioning earlier. Let's say, for instance, you want to pull out a certain field but add another one back. You can add, remove, and rearrange fields in the pivot table layout by just checking and unchecking the different boxes over on the right-hand side of the pivot table dialog box. Moving on to page 278, 279, additional details provided about the different layout options, the report filter. You can, of course, filter out certain types of fields. That's discussed on page 281. And then you can collapse and expand items discussed on page 282. This is similar to what I was talking about earlier with the outline view, but essentially if you want to increase or decrease the level of detail, you do that using the collapse or expand buttons, which are the plus or the minuses on the screen in the pivot table. You can sort the stuff in a pivot table based on ascending, descending order, that sort of thing, highest value to lowest value. That's talked about on page 283. 284 talks about removing field headers. 285 talks about something called a slicer. And a slicer, essentially, and if you look at the middle of page 285, this is where it's talked about. The definition, slicer provides a quicker and easier way to filter a pivot table or pivot chart. You can create a slicer for any field range in an Excel table. And essentially what it is, it's a quick way to add or remove or filter certain items. And that particular section in your textbook on page 285 and then 286 gives the example of adding a slicer for location. And so what happens is, to the right of the pivot table is what they've created on page 286. They can just click on a certain button, and that will essentially slice or filter the data, pull out certain items, and then give you a view for that particular location. And so it's a nice way to essentially create a shortcut to filter the data in a certain way so you can see it, view it, and so on. So a slicer is kind of like a quick shortcut to a filter. If you need to refresh a pivot table, this is on page 287. You can't manipulate or change the data within the pivot table. You have to go back to the data source. And once you do that, when you go back to the pivot table, it's important that you click refresh so that the data in the pivot table accurately reflects the data for the particular changes that you had made. You can also group on page 288. You can group pivot table items by dates, by times, by months, that sort of thing. Because occasionally you want to grab stuff and group it together in some sort of logical manner. In your textbook, they're talking about at the bottom of page 288 of using the date acquired field to be able to pull that stuff together and manipulate it so that things are arranged by the date acquired field. On page 291, it talks about creating a pivot chart, and a chart is really just like any other chart. It's just based on the pivot table data or the information. So you have the pivot table data, which represents data that you've manipulated, you've filtered, you've pivoted based on certain rows and columns of information. And the chart is just a visual representation of that. And it talks in step-by-step directions on page 291 and 292 about how to actually go in and create, in this case, I think they're creating looks like a a bar chart that allows the end user to quickly and visually see the data that's not just in the table, but now represented by a chart. As always, if you have any questions or need assistance with this topic or any of the others, I would encourage you to post to the lab questions area within the course. That way your fellow students can help. I can pop in and ask questions or provide any kind of responses and everything. And I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you and have a great day.